I'd like to begin this morning by offering all the mothers a very hearty Happy Mother's Day. Last year it was in God's providence that we landed on a pretty awesome text on Sunday morning. I was mentioning this to some of the guys during setup. Last year on Mother's Day, we were going through Judges, and we hit the story where Jael drives the tent peg through the head of Sisera, and Deborah's there, and Deborah's this like the great mother of Israel, and it's this awesome story that we had last Mother's Day. And this Mother's Day, however, we have quite a different story. I mean, what in the world is happening with these people? I have to admit, as I was studying for this one, this is one of those stories that it took a long time for me to finally come to a conclusion in terms of how to interpret this one. Now, as we've gone through Genesis, our exegesis, our study, has led us to some strange places and strange conclusions. I don't think that it was the conventional position that I taught when we talked about the sons of God and the daughters of men and the true nature of the Nephilim. When we spoke of Ham uncovering the nakedness of his father Noah, that certainly went in a direction that might not have been what many people expected. Well, here we are again at another strange tale, which there is certainly a mainstream way to understand this, sort of a predominant view to understand this, an interpretation that doesn't shed great light on Abram at all. But upon study and reflection, I don't think that that's the way that we want to go with this story here today. This is going to be yet another one where we want to try and look at a familiar story with some fresh eyes and try to understand what the author's doing here and what the main intent, what the main purpose of this narrative is. I think many times we get caught up by trying to turn these stories concerning redemptive history and to turn these narratives into morality tales. And very clearly, at first glance, if you just read through this, especially on a Mother's Day, and you see some of the behavior of Abram that is hard to discern, hard to understand, hard to justify, we'll try to leap to certain conclusions regarding his motivations and his actions. But one of the things that really hit me upon study is that most of the commentators who wanted to claim that the main idea here is the failures of Abram and some of his poor decisions, a lot of those commentators, or almost all of them, really make a ton of arguments from silence. Most of what you read criticize Abraham for what he doesn't do or what is not said, rather than paying close attention to what is said and what is described here in this story. And so with that change in orientation in mind, the fact that we want to just read what's here at face value and try to reach the same conclusions that the text reaches, we're going to dive into this story this morning under three distinct headings. The first point is this. I guess the first point is just simply this: like, Abraham did what? That's point number one. Abraham did what exactly? Let's just recount the story according to the bare facts. If you missed it, if you overlooked it, we'll just try to highlight some of the important ideas. As verse 10 describes, there's a great famine in the land, and this is very clearly talking about the land of Canaan, where Abram has been dwelling, where he's been wandering. He had just set up a couple of altars. Christ had just appeared to him, and then after that, there's this famine. The famine is one that is severe, it's said in verse 10, and the only way that he and his household are going to survive is for them to travel down south all the way into Egypt. And so that large caravan that we described last week, that large traveling party, the big household of Abraham, has to go beyond the borders of what God has revealed to him as his dwelling place, to travel down to sort of the heart of civilization, where it would have been reasonable for them to expect that they could survive, to travel down to the land of Egypt. And so they do. They sojourn there, we are told, which means they don't have final place to settle in is Egypt, just like in Canaan. They're nomads, so they start their wanderings at that time in the land of Egypt. Where things go weird, at least for us, is at verse 11 when he starts having this conversation with his wife Sarai. He turns to her in verse 11, and he makes this request. He requests of her once again that she would say that she is not his wife, but that she is merely his sister. Now that is true. She was Abram's half sister. So he's not necessarily asking her to lie, but he is asking her to tell a half truth, and the reason for that is given here. Apparently, Sarai is beautiful, and she's very clearly senior citizen age by this point already. But without the aid of Botox or lip filler, she's a woman advanced in her years, but is very, very beautiful. And Abram knows that her good looks are going to attract the Egyptians, these strange people that they're going to travel amidst. When the Egyptians see you, he says, they're going to see you're beautiful. And when they find out you have a husband, they're going to kill me. Now, there's something that should alert us right there already, in that this assumption can be made, and it seems, I don't know, maybe it's paranoid, maybe it's rational, but he jumps to this conclusion. We don't understand the logic. We'll try to get into it later, but he says, hey, just tell people, for our sake, for the sake of this family and household and for me, just say that you're my sister so that they don't kill you. Okay, I'll comment later. Moving on. So verse 15 happens, and the situation does indeed escalate. They enter into the land. The Egyptians see that the woman is very beautiful indeed, and the Egyptians that do see her, they let Pharaoh's house know. The word gets back to Pharaoh, and Sarai ends up being taken into Pharaoh's house. The assumption is that she's taken into Pharaoh's harem and that he has designs to marry her. That's very clear, because thinking that Abram is her brother, he starts lavishing all these gifts upon Abram. He gives him all this livestock. He enlarges his household, gives him servants and slaves, donkeys, camels. All this is added and heaped upon Abram. But then at that point in verse 17, something goes amiss. That Pharaoh is punished for these actions. That the Lord brings a curse down upon the house of Pharaoh, just as God had promised previously, like just a few verses later. God promised to Abram, he's going to bless those who bless him and curse those who curse him. And Pharaoh here has cursed Abram, and so the result is God sends plagues. Plagues start to afflict the Pharaoh and his house, until Pharaoh realizes what has happened. And he's able to build this correlation and to understand the meaning behind this, that this woman who he's taken into his house with intention to marry, that this woman already has a husband, and that is this man, Abram. What is this you have done to me? He says in verse 18. Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? There's this reality here that we get a hint of, and it's going to come into play quite a bit in the book of Genesis, is that according to the morality that is widely known and accepted, just the general ethic of that time, that it was a great evil to commit adultery with another man's wife. That it seems as though, according to Abram, the people would have had no problems with putting to death a man in order to take his wife. That wouldn't have seemed to be a huge deal. But what they're really worried about is committing adultery with this man's wife. That's just beyond the pale. That is completely unacceptable behavior. So Pharaoh complains to Abram, and then remarkably, at the end of the story, Pharaoh sends Abram and his house away, including all the stuff that he had given to Abram. So at the end of this story, Abram departs enlarged, enriched, with his wife safe and secure at his side. This is weird. This is weird. Certainly. And I don't blame you if you aren't quite sure what to think. It seems like there's a lot of mixed signals and a lot of things that conflict with our modern sensibilities taking place in this story. Who is in the right and who is in the wrong in this story? I mean, what do we take away from this? And then as a Christian church, how in the world are we going to try and apply some of the things revealed here and take them to heart as a people? This is certainly not one that's easy. It's a lot easier. It was a lot easier to just admit that, hey, yeah, I mean, demons are evil and they shouldn't mess with people and stay away from demonic entities. That's a whole lot easier. Or don't try to usurp your father's position of authority and the household, as in the case with him. But this is tough. So if we're left wondering what in the heck is going on, or what did Abram do here in our first point, the second point is this. I do want us to see, point number 2, the moral of the story. The moral of the story. The standard way to interpret this, and I think the most common thing that if you're familiar at all with this tale, you've at least heard this approach to it once. The standard interpretation is that this story does represent Abram's first major moral failure. Now, he will have others. There's going to be a lot that happens in his life that will call into question some of his behavior. But the most common interpretation and the most widely adopted interpretation says that, hey, this story comes right after Abram has accepted the call of Yahweh. He's sojourned and he's traveled over to the land of Canaan. He's been obedient in his faith. Christ has appeared to him, ministered to him, and Abram's worshipped him. But then immediately after that, his faith falters. A famine comes. He forsakes the land, travels to Egypt, and then compromises the integrity and puts at risk the sanctity, the purity of his wife. And that Abram is being deceitful to a fault, that he's not only being cunning or being clever here, but that he's actually in sin, that he's willfully giving over his wife to Pharaoh and to the people there, and that this story shows us that even the best examples in the Old Testament, God's people are flawed and sinful, and that this story shows that even this great man of faith can be shaky, and he requires growth in God's intercession. Now, that is true, and we can say that about not just Abram and other places, but all sorts of examples throughout the Scriptures. God's people are flawed. But there's this book that I'm reminded of that I read in seminary. It's not completely unrelated, but it's somewhat related. It was this book called Right Doctrine from the Wrong Text, and it was about Bible interpretation. And I think that if we go with that view of this passage, we might be finding the right doctrine, which is that even our heroes are sinners. That might be the right doctrine, but this is the wrong text to learn that particular lesson. I think that there's something else going on here, and that the truth is a little harder to get to. I mean, Abram is certainly being shrewd and being, in a sense, crafty here, but is it sin, and is the blame to be placed on him? And are we supposed to glean from his moral failures a warning here? Is it like a cautionary tale for us? I don't think that that's the case. But if that's true, then what is this? Well, I think we want to start by looking at some of the things that I mentioned earlier, that the text never explicitly lays any blame on Abram. It never tells us that what he did, his motivations and his actions were truly truly wrong. And the text, at least this version of this story, it doesn't comment on Abram in particular. And again, the amount of words that I read that commented on the fact that the silence of God on this matter then should condemn Abram. Like I read so much, but I just couldn't couldn't buy into that. Because not only is he not blamed in this passage, but someone else is cursed because of their actions. The Pharaoh receives plagues. He's a Pharaoh in Egypt, and God curses him with plagues. And then not only that, is at the end of this, Abram is enlarged and prospered. His household increases significantly. That God blesses Abram after this whole episode. That should at least give us pause and cause us to challenge and to ponder what exactly is happening here. Also, when you dig into some of the language describing the actions of the Egyptians and Pharaoh, they are very clearly in this passage depicted in unflattering terms. Like they are associated, quite frankly, with the serpent. There's a lot of language here in this passage that should hearken us back to Genesis chapter 3. Notice that Sarai she's named as Sarai, but then once it starts talking about the Egyptians seeing her, Sarai is called the woman, and the Egyptians are said to see her, to desire her, to see that she's beautiful. Similar language used in Genesis 3 for seeing and desiring the fruit. And then she is taken, she's seized in similar fashion. That the Egyptians, very squarely, and Pharaoh in particular, are for lack of a better term, the baddies, the bad guys in this story. They're the ones who are committing some sort of evil, and they are being wicked. Also, if we consider his flight to Egypt, the text makes it a point to say that his flight to Egypt is something born out of necessity. That it tells us that this famine in the land, which is stated twice, is one that is severe. So it wasn't, and it doesn't say that Abraham lacked faith or that he wavered and that he traveled when he wasn't supposed to, but that there was a natural necessity for him to go to Egypt in order to survive. His concern with survival is not spoken of negatively in this passage of all. In fact, when he goes to Egypt, born out of necessity, Abram is worried about one particular thing. And this is for us, again, we have to get past some of our assumptions about his actions, is that he's concerned and he's worried that the people of Egypt are going to act wickedly. There's something about this people that he knows is off and that their morality is askew. Again, he knows for somehow, whether it's a cultural thing, that's not entirely clear, but he thinks and he assumes that the people are going to be very willing to kill a woman's husband if they desire that woman, just so that they don't commit the grievous offense of committing adultery with her. That they would rather kill the husband to get what they want than commit adultery with a married woman. And so, because he anticipates this, like the evilness of Egypt and the wickedness of the people, his response is to take caution, to enter into that foreign land with craftiness, or to be shrewd, to try and approach a situation wisely. And it never tells us that he himself goes into sin on his own. What's also strange about this story is that this isn't the only place where this exact scenario plays out. This also takes place 3 times in the book of Genesis, twice with Abram, and then once with Isaac. It also happens, a similar story happens in Genesis 20, when Abram is dealing with Abimelech, and then later in chapter 24 with Isaac. And if we go and look at those 2 stories, even though we don't get a ton of motivation behind what Abram is doing here in this one, Abram's general motivation and the motivation for doing that sort of thing, for telling someone half-truths concerning that situation with your wife and your half-sister, his motivation is given very clearly in Genesis 20, for example. In 20, verse 11, when Abimelech discovers that that Sarah is Abraham at that point, that's his wife. Abimelech confronts Abraham, and we hear this in verse 11. It says that Abram said, "I did it because I thought there is no fear of God in all this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. Besides, she is indeed my sister, the daughter of my father, though not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. And when God caused me to wander from my father's house, I said to her, 'This is the kindness you must do to me. At every place to which we come, say to me, he is my brother.'" There's a couple of really important things that happen there. This whole strategy of telling people that this is my sister and not my wife, this is something that they cooked up and that they planned for even before they entered into the land of Canaan. This is something that was premeditated. This was a plan that they had agreed to, that she had consented to before they entered into Canaan. And the reason for that, the reason why they devised this whole scheme, is told for us there once again in verse 11, that they thought that there is no fear of God at all in this place. It was reasonable for Abram and for Sarai to think that the wicked people who didn't fear God would kill him when they wandered and people found out that she was his wife and not only his sister. And so his plan, and even as he gives his defense to Abimelech here, he gives a defense to say, "I didn't lie. I did not lie. This is indeed my sister. But she's my half-sister. She's not my full sister." Now, the interesting thing, though, about the difference between the story with Abimelech, which Lord willing we'll get to at some point, is that the issue with Abimelech is that Abraham treats him as though there's no fear of God. And that, in that situation, is an error, because Abimelech will come to tell Abram, like, "This is wrong. Why'd you do this to me? I would have never done that to you in the first place." And so Abraham, in that story at least, has to eat a little bit of crow, because Abimelech does indeed, in a sense, fear God. It has and he has some sense of morality, that he's not completely given over to wickedness. But there's no sense of that here with Pharaoh and the Egyptians. Now, it's hard to fully know the full social dynamic of how this arrangement works, why they would assume that they would rather murder than commit adultery, how that all works out. But at least on the surface, the text doesn't blame Abraham for taking caution. It does associate Pharaoh and the Egyptians with the serpent and the behavior of sin and wickedness. God brings his judgment. He curses Pharaoh, and then in the end, once again, Abram leaves with all this stuff, this increased blessedness. What seems to be going on here, and what I think is the right way to look at this then, is that for us to assume that Abram is willingly and consciously selling his wife and compromising her purity and giving her over to Pharaoh's household, and he knows that she's going to be compromised, that is for us just that, an assumption, perhaps something that we're reading into the text. He's not motivated by desire to compromise her purity, but he's motivated by the preservation of them both, and doing something that they've both already discussed before they even left to travel to the land of Canaan. And again, all the critique for the bad actions here are placed squarely upon the Egyptians themselves. I think the story for us does present to us a danger that we might have as modern people, of reading some of our sensibilities into older stories. We may not know exactly what's happening. Now, this interpretation might not fully satisfy you, and I understand that. We might think that this is still too much of a risk on Abram's part. That maybe he does show in this story too little concern for what might happen to his wife. maybe is a little too callous and not as cautious as we would have liked. And I definitely get that and think that that's a fair way to feel about this. But I think that would, once again, be maybe reading into a little bit of what's not there in this story of a frankly heavily patriarchal society. But if anything, I think that does for us, it does speak to the problem of turning these narratives into morality tales or cautionary tales. That if we go here and we primarily see this as just trying to teach us the failures of Abram and warn us against behaving like Abram in this way, I think that we've missed one of the major purposes of this short episode. But what might that main story be? And the last thing I want us to see is point number 3. Out of Egypt, I called my son. Point number 3, out of Egypt, I called my son. For us well-informed Bible readers who know the Bible back and forth and are familiar with every detail of every small story, when we hear about the people of God living in the land of Canaan, who experience a great famine, who have to go into Egypt, who are there captured and seized by the Pharaoh, and God has to bring plagues on Egypt so that Pharaoh may let his people go, I think very clearly for us, we should know, okay, this is maybe trying to tie to a different narrative. This is trying to connect Abraham to the people of Israel and to their slavery in Egypt. And that should be the first thing that we jump to try to understand what's happening in this story, because that is indeed the case. The Lord Yahweh has established Abraham as the head of this people who will eventually become the nation of Israel. He is establishing Abraham's name as the head of this people, of this nation. And so this story and the experiences of Abram, even in his early days, become for Israel, they function as Israel like a type for Israel. Meaning that the things that Abram and his descendants, Isaac and Jacob, experience, that they become sort of a pattern or a type that the people of Israel will one day have to follow along as well. Just as we as Christians, we talk about Israel as like all the time as a type for Christ and his church. So we spend all this time talking about the temple in Sunday school, and we say, well, that's a type to try to teach us about Christ and his sacrifice, and that's a story that happens ahead of time to give us insight to how to understand our lives. Well, for the people of Israel, this story of Abraham in Egypt functions for them as a type that Abram has to undergo personally what the people will undergo, that he's going to face the same sort of challenges and has to receive the same sort of deliverance that the people in later generations will. And so that is why the story of Abram in the land of Egypt and Israel in the land of Egypt sounds so similar. There's again, this great famine in the land. That's what, in both stories, forced the people to head south, to end up in Egypt. Pharaoh and the Egyptians, in both stories, mistreat the people. They take advantage of them for their own selfish desire. And it's not just this story that will associate Pharaoh and the Egyptians with the serpent, the great enemy, but so too in the Exodus. When the Red Sea covers the armies of the Pharaoh, they're called serpents and snakes. What does Pharaoh and his magicians do? And what is the sign Moses given? It's a sign of a serpent. There's all this imagery happening and connecting these two stories. The God of Israel will triumph over the powers of the people of Egypt in both stories. He brings curses in the form of plagues and forces the Pharaoh's hand to let the people go, and for the people to leave the land of Egypt enlarged in both stories. Both the house of Abraham and then the people who take the possessions with them upon the Exodus. the story that is happening here is telling us that even though Abram is a soldier and at the mercy of the powers of the world, it's again reinforcing the idea that God is with him. That he's there sojourning amongst the might of the world, and yet Yahweh is faithful. Yahweh is preserving Abram even in the sojourning of this evil land, a land that is hostile. And so if there's any sort of lesson for us to draw in this, or from this, it is the necessity sometimes, like Abram, frankly, to be shrewd, and in a sense, to be cautious, to exercise wisdom. Again, that's not an excuse to fight sin with sin. That's not to stoop to the level of your opponent. It's not to take up the weapons of the world in order to combat the world. You don't lower yourself to the standard set by your enemies, but you do recognize in the midst of sojourning that your enemies are your enemies, and they are out to destroy you. We don't walk willfully and volunteer to enter into the arena, into the pit to face lions. We don't willfully offer ourselves up for slaughter without a purpose. But when suffering does come, we do endure it by faith. I think the lesson that is truly taught here is similar to what we read from Matthew chapter 10. That as Christ sends out his disciples, he tells them that he's sending them out as sheep amongst wolves, and so they must be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. And I think that the reality is that is what Abram's doing here in this situation. That is the way God in Christ operates, even in his wanderings in the world as well. He has entered into, or at the incarnation, Jesus Christ entered into a hostile world, a world filled with enemies, a world that was waging, that was waging spiritual warfare against him, that he was doing battle against the evil one and the forces of darkness. And Christ was indeed shrewd, cunning, even calculated, taking caution. I mean, on the one hand, Christ is going to recapitulate this story himself. He's going to literally, as an infant, travel to Egypt to avoid being killed by Herod, which was a wise and crafty decision, but on the sake of his parents. But all of his actions, even though they were veiled in humility, and they were veiled in his suffering, all of his actions still were aimed at overcoming his oppressors and disarming and defeating the devil. He didn't suffer anything needlessly, but willingly gave up his life. He died so that through death, the power of death might be destroyed. And there was nothing more crafty and more wise in his dealings with the devil than turning the devil's own weapons, namely death, against him. Take caution, Christian, in this life. Recognize the true position you find yourself in the midst of your sojourning and in your wanderings in this world. It is right to be cautious, to rightly assess the wicked intentions of the world and the powers of the world. This is a warning against just pure pacifism, or lacking any sense of self-defense. We don't blindly walk into evil, but we are to take care for yourself, take care for your family, your children, and be wise, yet don't sin. And even in the midst of that, sometimes the wisest course of action and the best thing for you will require your suffering and in your laying down of yourself for the sake of your enemy. Suffering at the hands of evil men in this life is something that is unavoidable. If you are to live holy before God, if you're going to live for Christ, it will put you at odds with others and will lead at times to your suffering. And that's what taking up your cross is all about. But understand that even when you do suffer, it's not pointless. It's not without just cause, and it's not without being unto a wise and meaningful end. We are, in such moments, heaping the wrath of God upon our enemies, which is a terrible and frightful thing. The whole motivation we have for loving and for praying for enemies is that because we know the judgment that awaits them. That same judgment that we deserve, that Christ paid for on the cross, it is yet to be doled out and delivered to our enemies. As we wander in this life and suffer, we are, as Paul said, filling up the sufferings of Christ in our own lives, in a sense. And may such moments, for Abram as it is for all God's people, may such moments where we do have to endure remind us that this world is not our home, and that we are journeying and wandering to a great and glorious future. And as we suffer, not only do we reap wrath and judgment upon those who would oppose Christ and his people, but we are sowing great treasures that will be reaped for us in heaven. May that call to wander wisely and to be even as wise as a serpent, yet innocent as a dove, be one of the ways in which we go about our time here on this life. Let's pray.